All right, this week we're looking at what James had to say about the birds and bees of temptation. This is in James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15, and these three verses are packed with goodies. Let's dive in and take a look at verse 13. This is from the ESV. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So the first thing to note is that in Greek, in this first verse, verse 13, there are four verbs, and all four verbs are in the present tense. It's ongoing action, ongoing conditions. The second thing that we're going to look at more closely is the phrase, God cannot be tempted. Because in the ESV, you kind of lose the sense of the verb that's used. Let's take a look in Greek. Gartheos aperastos estin kakon. So the verb here is estin. He, she, or it is. The subject of that verb is theos, God. For God is, and then we have this word sandwiched in the middle, aperastos. Aperastos is a negated form of temptation. So he is not temptable. He is not subject to temptation. So God is not subject to temptation, kakon, by evil things, by evils. So why does this matter? By using estin, by using the stative verb, James is telling us about the nature of God, not what God does or doesn't do. He's saying in his nature, temptation has no effect on him. He's not subject to temptation whatsoever. And then he goes on to tell us, and God tempts no one. So when you're struck with temptation, James wants you to understand that God is not in either side of the temptation business. He's not subject to it as a recipient, and he doesn't tempt others. That's not a part of his thing. That's not what he does. Which we see in the next part, peradze de autos udena. He does not tempt anyone, right? So there's no validity in any claim. This is according to James. Others may have a different take in other books. There's no validity to a claim of being tempted by God. That's just not what he does. Let's move on to verse 14. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So, again from the ESV. Let's jump right in. Ekastos de, so each one, but each one, peradzetai, is tempted, hupo tes idias epithumias, by his own desire. Idias, like an idiom, a thing that is unique to oneself. Idiopathic disease, a sickness that is just your own. Like I have an idiopathic pain. I have this pain in my hip. It's not a disease, it's just this thing of mine, right? So that's what he says. Each person, when they're tempted, is tempted by their own desire. And then look at these next two participles, fantastic stuff. Exelkomenos kai deleadzomenos. While being drawn out, exelkomenos is a present tense participle, while being drawn out and while being enticed or lured. Again, all three verbs in verse 14 are present tense. These are ongoing things. The temptation is ongoing, and the temptation by your own desire is happening while being drawn out continually and while being enticed or lured continually. Let's look at the two participles. Exelkomenos is a passive participle from exelko, which means I draw out or I lure. In secular Greek, in classical Greek, this word, this elko, exelko, was used to describe the effect of a magnet on iron, that there was a drawing, a tension, a pulling toward, and it was also used to describe like a magic spell, like if you were under a supernatural influence by one of the gods or by a spirit, you are being drawn by the power of this other thing. So James says, when you're tempted, you're being tempted by your own desire, and that desire has like a spell on you that's pulling you or drawing you. It's like a magnetic force that's dragging at you. And then the second participle is deleiadzamenos, and this is a great one again, passive. It's a passive participle, present tense passive participle, and this comes from the word deleiar, which is bait. Bait like you're fishing, not with a net, but with a line and a hook, right? So he says, when you're tempted by your own desire, being drawn out by this magnetic force under this sort of spell, and being enticed or lured as though there was bait being dangled in front of you. I've been fishing for 53 years now. My dad started me out when I was 3. So I've spent a lot of time dealing with bait, and what I've come to understand is that bait is only as effective as it is attractive. Okay, what do I mean by that? Let me say that again. Bait is only as effective as it is attractive. If you wanted to go shark fishing, you wouldn't bait up your hook with a head of broccoli, right? Because the shark is not attracted to broccoli. For bait to be effective, it has to be attractive. So think about what James is saying. When you're tempted by your own desire. Those are the things that you find attractive. That's an effective bait. That's an effective lure to entice you because you're interested in those things. You know what has no hold over me? Gambling. I see people crushed by the influence of the temptation of gambling. You know why gambling is not an effective or attractive bait to lure me? I hate to lose. The only thing I hate more than losing is losing money. So gambling has no pull on me. There are other things, however, that do. And so that's the case for everyone in James's argument. When you're tempted by your own desire that's pulling and drawing you, that's dangling in front of your face a bait, a lure that is appealing to you. If it wasn't attractive, it wouldn't be effective. But because it comes from inside you, it is attractive and has a greater likelihood of being effective. So James says that's what your own desires are doing. They're drawing you and luring you like with bait to catch you. Let's go on to verse 15. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. There's a big shift here. All the verbs in the previous 2 verses were in the present tense. That's about to change. Let's take a look. Eta he epithumia sulabusa tikte hamartion. There's the first half of the verse. So heta, then, notice what he says, he epithumia, it's articular. Then the desire, not a desire, not desire as a general concept, the desire from the previous verse that came from inside yourself that was drawing you out and luring and enticing you. That desire, he says, after it has conceived, sulabusa, after it has conceived, tikte gives birth to what? Hamartion, to sin. So think about that for a moment. The specific desire that was luring and enticing you conceived and gave birth. The participle is not in the present tense. It's an aorist. It's talking about an inceptive event, something new happening, conception. Sulabusa comes from sulambano, to receive with, to receive together, to bring together in reception. This is when there has been the introduction of seed and the egg and the sperm come together, conception takes place, and a new thing is formed. That's what he tells us. This is successful conception in the womb. Conception is not the result of casual contact. No matter what anybody may have said to you, you cannot conceive as a result of the toilet seat or the public swimming pool. No one has ever said, oh man, look, watch where you're going. You bumped into my shoulder and now I'm pregnant. That's not how that works, right? Conception requires intimate contact. And look at what James is telling us. It starts out with a desire, with an attraction. And that attraction, that desire from inside you is pulling, it's drawing, it's bringing you out from a safe place. It's luring and enticing you. And then he says, after that desire has conceived, which is only possible if there's been intimate contact, he then says that the desire gives birth to sin. Let's move on to the second part. Hede hamartia apotelesthesa apokue thanaton. So hede hamartia, and the sin, notice again, articular, the one that was born from your intimate contact with the desire that led you out and lured you, the dalliance with your own desires. He says, when that sin becomes mature, apolesthesa, after it grows to its end, after it reaches adulthood, it produces not more sin, but death. So think about it. Procreation anticipates life. It anticipates producing life. But here, this procreation produces death. In the previous clause, he refers to birth using the verb tikte. And tikte is about the birth of a newborn from its mother's body. Okay? But here, when we get to death, he doesn't use tikte, he uses apokue. And apokue, so he says apokue thanaton, it brings forth death. The difference between tikte and apokue is very significant because tikte, as I said, is of the baby emerging from its mother's body. And apokue is the production of a child, but it's not mother specific. Why does that matter? Because this is not about the responsibility of the desire. This is about the responsibility of the barking chihuahua. Let the chihuahua bark at the mailman for a second and then we'll continue. So this is about the responsibility of the one who had the desire, who allowed him or herself to be drawn out, to be enticed and lured, who engaged in the intimate contact with the desire that resulted in conception and the desire giving birth to sin. And then when that sin is fully formed into its adulthood, it results not in new life but in death. James puts the responsibility on the person who had the desire and who flirted and allowed themselves to engage in the intimate contact with the desire, the object of that desire, and is now responsible for the ultimate end of this situation. Pretty astonishing stuff. So, look at what James did in these 3 short verses. He took a very relatable metaphor, desires, lusts, flirtations, procreation, birth, conception, birth, life and death. These are things that everybody who's going to hear this epistle read, who's going to receive this message is going to get, they're going to understand. So puts the responsibility on the one who is tempted by his own desires, namely everyone, right? Except God, because he's not subject to temptation, nor does he tempt anyone. The one who allowed him or herself to be lured and enticed as though with bait, the one who engaged in that intimate contact with those desires, and the one who sired the sin that's responsible for death that the mature sin produces. The birds and the bees of temptation, according to James. God didn't do it. The temptation is rooted in your own desires. The desires didn't do it. It's only through the flirtation and the engagement in intimate contact that if you take the bait, the sin is born, and when the sin reaches maturity, it produces not more life but death. So James is really clever in this metaphor, wasn't he? I hope that was interesting for you, and if it was, please like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Tell your friends that you learned about the birds and bees of temptation according to James at Koine Corner, and maybe they'll come and check it out too. Until next time, Kars Kai Rene Humin, grace and peace to you.